So today's lesson in chapter 12 is looking at the physiological side and the psychological side of sexual motivation. When we look back to when this was first researched, it dates back to the late 40s and early 50s. A man by the name of Alfred Kinsey was a professor at Indiana University, and he and his colleagues investigated sexual motivation after, as a biology professor, students were asking him questions that he didn't have answers to. So he set out to find some. His research was extremely controversial given the fact that it was the 40s and early 50s. And what he did is he had participants come in and he conducted over 17,000 face-to-face interviews, asking them very personal, intimate questions about their sexual practices. And from those interviews, he collected the data and authored several books. And these books were in high demand. People wanted to know what was going on and what kind of questions were being asked and what the answers were. So he dared to really lift the veil of shame from a society in which sex was hidden, knowledge was dangerous, and talking about it was really ultimately taboo. The later studies that were conducted happened around the 1960s. Other scientists recorded, with the help of 382 females and 312 male volunteers, these volunteers came in and they actually agreed to either be videotaped or watched completing these sexual response cycles. It was highly controversial, but what's important to understand is that these were scientists. These were actual doctors, gynecologists, obstetricians that wanted to understand the sexual response cycle because they had several patients that could not complete it. So these volunteers, which obviously were an atypical sample, people who were able and willing to display their sexual practices while being observed in a laboratory, they were able to monitor or film more than 10,000 sexual response cycles. And they did this and found out that it was the same in both men and women, stages 1 through 4. However, men were the only gender to actually have a refractory period. This was not present in women. But they wanted to find out what a healthy sexual response cycle was so that they could ultimately treat their patients that had sexual disorders. This is a problem that consistently impairs sexual arousal or functioning. And so they looked at whether or not it was a physiological problem or if it was more psychological in origin. And they found that in some cases it was psychological. In some cases, they actually had some kind of physical problem. So they offered therapy when the medications in 1998, like that of Viagra, Cialis, Levitra, became available. They found that medication, especially with ED, erectile disorder, was able to effectively treat it. They also were surprised at how many men, especially, who was dealing with their sexual disorder privately, came out and talked to their physician openly about the problems they were having. So that was really what sparked the curiosity and the interest of learning about people's sexual practices. Another section on sexual motivation is dealing with hormones and sexuality. We know that men and women have sex hormones that are produced. They direct their physical development. We talked about primary and secondary sex characteristics in men and women, and how when they hit puberty, primary characteristics allow for reproduction to take place. Secondary sex characteristics are the non-reproductive characteristics, like the deepening of the male voice, growth of body hair, development of breasts in women, those kinds of things. Sex hormones also activate sexual behavior. So the first one we talk about is estrogen. This is a sex hormone that is secreted in greater amounts by females than males. Even though males produce estrogen, they produce a lesser amount. In non-human female mammals, estrogen levels peak during ovulation, and this promotes sexual receptivity. This is oftentimes when you see female animals in heat. And we know for women, estrogen secretion does peak during ovulation. And we know that premenstrual PMS can affect their mood, it can affect their skin quality. Sometimes people know that they're about to get their period because they break out with acne. And so these are also things that are affected by levels of estrogen in the system. Testosterone is the male sex hormone that even if women don't have testes, they do produce levels of testosterone. The additional testosterone in males stimulates growth of male sex organs. We know that boys don't start producing sperm until they hit puberty with the increase in the testosterone levels. So when we look at sexual motivation, we know that there are biological factors that you see listed. There are psychological factors, which we don't have a slide on in the PowerPoint. But in this section, it talks about like physical attraction that is somewhat based on the environment. They even talk about exposure to stimulating conditions and sexual fantasies and how these are determinants in people's sexual practices. They also take a look at the social cultural aspect. They look at family and societal values, the religious and personal values and beliefs, and cultural expectations. We know that people's attitudes and views towards sexual practices and sexual motivation are very different depending where you are in the world. Another aspect of this book is looking at adolescent sexuality and teen pregnancy. And unfortunately, teenage pregnancy rates are highest in the United States. And there are some contributing factors. Adolescent physical maturation is, a big part of their identity. And the rate at which teens, are having intercourse do vary from culture to culture. In the 20th century, there's definitely been an increase in sexual activity in North America. And that also then reflected the number of adolescent pregnancies. In this section of the book, they talk about just simply not having adolescents that are educated about contraception. They do preach abstinence in our sexual education programs, but they oftentimes don't talk about contraception. And if they do minimally. So there is some correlation between the higher rate of teenage pregnancy and not being educated. There's guilt related to sexual activity, people not wanting to carry contraception or be on birth control, and they get in situations where they make choices and they don't have contraception available. So minimal communication about birth control at home. Alcohol use, which lowers inhibitions, it clouds people's judgment. They might make a poor choice based on the alcohol in their system. Another aspect is mass media norms of unprotected promiscuity and how many television programs and movies show people being intimate and not using contraception, kind of a glorified view of it. This also translates to higher amounts of sexually transmitted infections. People under the age of 25 account for 2/3 of these infections. Teen girls seem to be especially vulnerable. They have less mature bodies, lower levels of protective antibodies. And attempts to protect teens through education programs, again, emphasize abstinence. They do find that there are some predictors of those who are able to restrain from sexual practices. They believe there's a correlation between higher intelligence, religion, father presence, and participation in activities. Sexual orientation is another aspect of sexual motivation. It's defined as an enduring sexual attraction towards members of either one's own sex, homosexual orientation, or the opposite sex, heterosexual orientation. We find that studies have revealed statistically that 3 to 4% of men and 1 to 2% of women are homosexual, and that it is something that is enduring or long-lasting. These statistics might be a little low based on the fact that this book was published in 2007. What our book goes on to talk about is how when we look at sexual orientation, there tends to be two sides, the nature versus nurture debate. What they have found through research with homosexuality is that there is not a cause and effect relationship between being homosexual and any of the following: the child's relationship with their parents, father-absent homes, fear or hatred of people of the opposite gender, childhood sexual experiences, peer relationships, and dating experiences. So all of the environmental sides or explanations as to why someone might be homosexual have not been supported. There is a cause and effect relationship, however, evidence supporting that it is biological. They have seen same-sex behavior in several hundred species, from owls to penguins to chimpanzees and gorillas, grizzly bears, and sheep. They've seen differences in body and brain characteristics. They have found in studies of cadavers who have been donated, in a blind study, they have found that the hypothalamus has larger cell clusters in heterosexual men than that of gay men and women. Genetic studies of family members and twins show that it does tend to run in families, and that identical twins have a higher incidence of homosexuality than do fraternal. They've even looked at the effect of exposure to certain hormone levels of estrogen and testosterone during critical periods of prenatal development. So again, this really supports the idea that in terms of our sexual orientation, it does tend to be supported by a biological explanation.